Now, Mr. Johnston, what we have before this committee are two completely different descriptions of your relationship with Justin Trudeau. Those two different descriptions cannot be accurate at the same time. So my question is simple and direct, Mr. Johnston. Were you telling Canadians the truth on May the 23rd or back in 2016?
Complaint, but there's 11 candidates, and you've said in your report that they were victims of a certain form of interference in the election. These were candidates for the election, but you're saying, as there's no complaint, I'm not going to meet with the Commissioner of the Elections, the Director of Elections, and the Chief Election Officer. Is that correct?
Well, Madam Chair, we expect that we will meet with those two officials in subsequent review. What I was saying is that our understanding there were no complaints directed to them that required action with regard to the 2019 and 2021 election.
I'm really aghast at what I have heard.
Time that we're talking about being so precious. Allowing the witness to finish a sentence, I do not think would take too much time, and I think it's appropriate just to let the witness answer. Mr. Brock, I agree the time is yours, but let's just be mindful, and I think we can get through this. And I know you can, Mr. Brock, so I'm going to pass you back the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I want to use my time to talk about some of the details of the report. And I'll turn to my first question through you, Madam Chair. My first question is in relation to a question that I asked of the Prime Minister on May 9th. I asked a question in question period about the impact of foreign interference on the diaspora, which you alluded to in the public hearings, will be a major part of your public hearings. I asked a question to the Prime Minister about the impact on diaspora communities of foreign interference. And in response, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The diaspora, whether the Canadian, the Chinese Canadian, the Iranian Canadian, the Russian Canadian, or the Indo-Canadian communities are often the first communities to be targeted by foreign interference." And in fact, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, Jody Turner, also highlighted that foreign interference, particularly from India, has an impact on Canadians, especially the Sikh community. And many people from diaspora communities will tell you, though they left communities of oppressive regimes, they come to Canada hoping for security, liberty, and safety, only to be pursued by that same interference. And in the Sikh community, many people will share stories of being denied visas or their communities being threatened, their family members being threatened for raising concerns about the human rights track record of India, for example. Given that that is well known that this exists, and particularly the Prime Minister has expressed that it exists, that these threats exist to diaspora communities, how do you expect that people from diaspora communities, knowing that they are already targeted, knowing that they're already at the risk of personally being targeted or their families being targeted, how would someone from a diaspora community have any sort of confidence to attend a public hearing, given the threats to themselves, to their community, and potential backlash and repercussions to their family? And how would they have the confidence that they could show up to a public hearing? How would that process work for them? And are there any steps being taken to protect their security and their concerns that they have?
Thank you for those questions, which are really vital, important, and require very thoughtful attention. You're quite right. The diaspora communities have been beset with interference, with disturbance of their tranquility, with their own safety and their well-being in ways that are just unconscionable. And it behooves all of us to see this as a very serious threat in our community, where pluralism and respect for one's cultural heritage are very important values to us. And it has been neglected far too long. I look at Mr. Chong over here, who's chair of the Canada Relations Committee, for example, reams and reams of testimony from diaspora communities about this particular matter, and we have not done the kind of things that we should do, and we must do, because it is real, it is damaging, and it is simply unacceptable for Canadian citizens. what we hope to do in the balance of the 5 months is to put a real light on this issue of the threats that diaspora communities are under and develop much more effective ways of, one, equipping ourselves with our intelligence agencies to deal with them more effectively than them, and secondly, acquainting Canadians to the fact that so many people in the diaspora communities are unwitting victims of something that lies far beyond them, and that we as Canadians have a responsibility to protect them, to embrace them, to say this is not acceptable and we'll not sit here and let it stand, and to recognize that that's happening to these communities and take adequate steps in terms of our governmental protections to see it. And in the last month or so, we have seen a step forward in at least trying to provide better understanding and warnings to members of Parliament, others who've been subjected, whose families have been subjected to these things. That, too, requires very important remedies.
Thank you. Again, through you, Madam Chair, I'm hoping you'll also address how those families will feel safe to come forward, or how those individuals feel safe to come forward. But my second question I want to touch on, you identified the serious shortcomings in communication between security agencies and the government. And you made it clear that there were no examples where the Prime Minister, ministers, or their office knowingly or negligently failed to act on intelligence, advice, or recommendations. So it's conceivable that in your report that the ministers or Prime Minister was not properly informed. But you also recognize in your conclusion that it is very clear that foreign governments are absolutely or undoubtedly attempting to interfere in our democracy, and that this is something that's been well known. Given how clear it is that there is foreign interference going on and that the government ought to have known that, generally speaking, there's foreign interference going on, my question is about the utter lack of curiosity of this government, that despite clear and credible evidence of foreign interference, that in your investigation, at no point in time did the Prime Minister or ministers ever actively or proactively ask CSIS or other security agencies whether or not members of Parliament were being targeted. Was there never an attempt to proactively assess threats to members of Parliament? While you accept that they were not maybe advised of this from CSIS, did they never have that curiosity to say, well, if we know that there's foreign interference going on, maybe it's impacting our members of Parliament? Was there never any evidence of that curiosity, interest in following up?
Madam Chair, thank you for both questions and repeating the one that I'll answer very shortly, but I hope helpfully. With respect to would we expect members of the diaspora community to be able to appear before a public hearing in openness, I'm quite confident they will in many instances. In instances where they do not want to be there, we would receive submissions. We've already received perhaps a half a dozen or so submissions from diaspora communities, very painfully and eloquently setting out the burdens that they're bearing and crying out for help. In cases of people who feel they can't come and see in person, we would invite and encourage whatever information they can give us, and in particular what steps we can take. Now let's come to the question of curiosity and dealing with those foreign threats. In our report, as you know, we've been quite critical of shortcomings of the government, and indicating that we have been slow to react, slow to anticipate in many instances, and those must be changed. But they'll be changed with the work of this committee and other parliamentary committees. NCCOP and CIRA, one in place since 2017, the other 2019, are review and oversight committees. That's the kind of responsibility that are our agencies working properly or not? And we must bolster that kind of thing. And so I'm in quite agreement that we have not had the kind of curiosity and particularly the flow of information so it can be acted upon that we need.
I appreciate that.
And I hope we can address that.
Thank you, Mr. Johnston. And finally, through the chair to you, Mr. Johnston, I want to point out a particularly concerning different conclusion that you arrived at in comparison to Mr. O'Toole, and I want to highlight Mr. O'Toole raised a question of privilege, and he indicated, and I just want to quote a portion of what he said with my time remaining, that the briefing he received from CSIS confirmed to me, this is Mr. O'Toole, what I suspected for quite some time, that my party, several members of my caucus, and I were targets of misinformation and voter suppression, and that was orchestrated by China before and during the 2021 election. So members of the Conservative caucus and himself were targeted. In your report, you find that you, in reference to Mr. Chu, who was, of course, a member of the Conservative Party and a candidate in the 2021 election, that misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source. So we've got two very different conclusions from a CSIS briefing that Mr. O'Toole is referring to, and then you're stating in your report that there was no clear evidence that it was state-sponsored. How could you have such different conclusions from what Mr. O'Toole received?
Well, again, Madam Chair, I appreciate that particular question, and I've asked to be brief. We did have an opportunity to meet with Mr. O'Toole shortly before our report was completed and did take into consideration what he had to say to us. And I must say he has been a very knowledgeable, thoughtful person about this and has much more to contribute. The evidence that we had before us that permitted us to come to the conclusion you've suggested was what was available to us at that time. I think since that time, the conversations that Mr. O'Toole has had with the director of CSIS, I think there's been a much greater step in terms of what should have been done and what must be done in the future.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Johnston. Mr. Johnston, I was quite shocked in your opening comments when you said the comments on your integrity are false, and the fact that we repeat them doesn't make them true. I think that this statement alone puts you in a situation of a conflict of interest, in particular towards the leaders of the opposition. Mr. Johnston, you were Governor-General of Canada, so you could not exercise any political role, but you still have a pay as former Governor-General. Is that correct?
Could you repeat the question, Madam Chair? What as a pay as?
Do you continue to receive pay as former Governor-General? You still receive payment?
Madam Chair, I don't receive any payment as former Governor-General. I have a pension as a public servant, and that is paid. And there's...
Merci.
Thank you. You were a member of the Trudeau Foundation for how many years?
Madam Chair, thank you for that question. I joined the association of the Trudeau Foundation. That's like a shareholder at a general meeting, not a member of the board of directors, not involved in any decision making.
C'est pas la question, Monsieur.
That's not the question.
To vote in the board to approve the financial statements, no involvement in fundraising of that kind. And I resigned, that was 2018, and I resigned in March of this year when I was appointed to this role.
Vous avez déclaré.
You have declared in an interview in 2016 talking about relationship with the family of the Prime